They laughed as if watching a comedy, the kind that punctures dignity and leaves a person transparent to the room. Sofia felt each laugh land like a stone in her ribs. Glasses chimed somewhere above her head. Crystal light fractured across the sequins of the hall and turned every look into a blade. She stood near the edge of the main table, palms pressed to the fabric of her dress, as if she could stitch herself into something less visible. Around her, the guests rearranged their opinions like jewelry, shiny, threadbare, and cruelly discerning. Bet, wearing the kind of arrogance that had been tailored to fit the room, moved through the crowd with Fred at her elbow. Their laughter was bright and predatory. Bet leaned in close enough for Sofia to smell perfume, an expensive, planned scent, and she let her voice drop so the circle nearest could taste the venom. "Look at her," Bet murmured to Fred, loud enough for Sofia to hear. You could tell they'd had to settle. Cheap on the neckline, cheaper on the dowry. Do you think he showed up with nothing? Typical. A ripple of laughter followed. Someone pointed toward the loose chain at Sofia's throat, an unremarkable silver pendant, bought at a market stall where the owner almost cried when Sofia counted change. Bet flicked the pendant with a manicured finger, as if testing the metal, and the finger's edge traced a mock circle around Sofia's life like an accusation. Sofia's father stood a few steps away, his face a map of lines etched by choices he had once believed clever. He met her eyes once and then looked away. The exchange of looks was a pact of shame between them. He had orchestrated this marriage swap, demanded it as if bargaining could erase debt, and he had not told her Cedric's true standing. Or maybe he had, and she had refused to hear. The memory of their conversation was a raw thing. Paper money, a signature, a whispered negotiation in a room where men spoke in figures and women were counted as collateral. "It will settle debts," he had said, voice small and urgent. "It will save us." Sofia had felt the words land and become a sentence she couldn't reject. "He didn't know my father forced him to marry me," she thought now, an echo she did not plan to confess aloud. The truth tasted like copper. It was the wound and also the reason she had come, not as a ceremonious conquest, but as someone arranged into a role. She had not imagined the arrangement would be performed on stage. The ceremony had been brief, an exchange of vows that felt both ceremonial and accidental, as if a set had been reset and they had placed her on it without her consent.
Cedric had stood beside her, eyes honest but guarded, and when the crowd's attention found him, he offered a small, deferential smile that read like apology. He had arrived not as a triumphant prince, but as a man who seemed to belong in a life less gilded. Perhaps that was why they were so quick to take aim at him and at her. "Where is he?" a woman near the champagne bar hissed. "Where's the grand entrance?" The poor man couldn't even bring himself to be on time. Sofia felt each whisper like cold wind through a seam. The rumors built a scaffolding around them, that she had been married off to a nobody for the family's convenience, that she would never belong here, that Cedric had accepted the match with an untroubled indifference to her status. The engagement ring, an old heirloom their hosts insisted on producing, refused to shine. When the jeweler slid it on for show, it stuck for a breath too long on Sofia's finger. Someone gasped, as if the ring's resistance were evidence of some larger social wrong. That gasp became the punctuation everyone waited for. "We'll make it permanent tonight," Fred announced with theatrical magnanimity. "We can celebrate despite the unexpected alliances." It was language meant to cover shame with festivity. Sofia listened as if the words were being spoken in some other room entirely. She wanted to stand and tell them all the truth, about the contract her father had signed, about the nights the house had been empty, and the phone calls that had emptied the pantry. But there was a fierceness in her that had learned how to stand still under pressure. She curved her spine like someone learning a new posture, small and contained, and ultimately hers. Her friend Daisy came close, an urgent hand on her elbow. "Sofia," Daisy breathed, lowering her voice. "Don't let them." Sofia shook her head once, a tiny, resolute motion. "Let them live with their pettiness," she said, and the words tasted like a dare. "I will not be their spectacle." The sound of shoes on marble announced a different kind of arrival. The room shifted at the entry door as a hush folded over the crowd, less a respectful silence and more the collective recalculating of expectations. Cedric came in as if the air around him was a field he had to cross carefully,
like someone walking between rows of crops he intended to harvest. He was not late so much as he was measuring the moment. He wore a suit that sat comfortably on him. It wasn't ostentatious, but it fit like someone who had learned how to be seen without drawing too much attention. A watch caught the light. Simple, elegant, an oddity among the overt labels and logos. It flashed and then was concealed under his cuff. Sofia noticed everything because she had learned to read small things for truth. When Cedric reached her side, he bent his head to whisper something that only she could hear. "They will try to corner you," he said. "Step away from them. Follow me." His voice was low and warm, and it had a steadiness that cut through the brittle room. People turned to watch, searching for the weak link they could exploit, but when Cedric squared his shoulders, they faltered. He did not raise his voice. He did not match Bet. Instead, he took Sofia's hand in an unassuming but definite gesture. It felt like anchoring, a promise in a place built of mirrors. Bet made a show of being offended, as if comfort had suddenly grown on the wrong side of taste. "How quaint," she said to a circle of women who loved spectacle, "playing the protector now, for a girl who can't even afford the right fabrics." "A protector?" Cedric's reply was mild and measured. "No, she deserves better than insults from people who profit from other people's failures." It was a small law he wrote in the air. It startled the crowd because it breached expectation. Bet's mouth shaped a retort and then closed. The crowd was, for a breath, unmanned. Sofia felt something loosen inside her, hope and something like relief braided together. Still, she felt shame like a second skin, habitual, not to be shed with a single kind word. After the ceremony, the party moved into a private salon for photos and speeches. The patriarch, Mr. Collins, called Dom by the circle who owed him fear and favor, sat like a king who had misplaced the crown but not the power. He watched everything with the slow appraisal of someone who had learned to measure people like ledgers. When the speeches began, Fred took the floor as if it were his right to mark the day with his opinion. He cleared his throat and produced the kind of toast that was meant to sting. "To new beginnings," he declared loudly, "for those who come to taste a life better than they were given." Applause followed. Someone clinked a glass in ironic concurrence. Sofia could feel the melody of mockery thread through the room like a pattern she had been named into. Cedric, however, did not rise to the bait. He stayed by her side and let her shoulder find his, a quiet protection that altered the room's rhythm. It was in those small acts, the way he turned a conversation, the way he intercepted a hand reaching for her, that Sofia began to understand that his humility was not emptiness. It was a guarded, deliberate choice. Later, outside in the cool of the evening, when the music from the hall was a distant tide, Sofia's father found her. He was a more fragile man in the night air, the bravado of the day stripped away. He reached forward and placed a hand on her arm in a clumsy, almost tender gesture. "I'm sorry," he said, voice brittle. "I thought I was protecting us." Sofia looked at him. She had rehearsed recriminations. She had sworn to make him feel the full weight of what he'd done. But when she saw the lines carved into his face, worry turned to regret. Her anger settled into a sharper thing, understanding without forgiveness. "You forced him," she said simply. "You signed the papers."
"You decided that we would stand in front of people and become barter." He nodded. "It was the only way to keep the creditors quiet. They would have taken the house. They were already trying." "He didn't know," Sofia murmured, not looking at him. The truth felt like a private document between them. "He didn't know you forced him into this." Her father's shoulders bowed. "I couldn't bear to tell him that we'd sold him a future as if he were cattle. I thought I could live with the lie." Sofia's refusal to explode surprised him, and she surprised herself. The world had taught her to keep the danger contained. Lashing out would do nothing to change the ledger. So she folded her hands and let the quiet do its work. "Thank you for not making a scene," she said finally. "But you must be prepared for consequences." He looked at her with a child's pleading in his eyes. "I'm already paying for it." There was a long silence full of small confessions. If their marriage had been arranged as currency, then the consequences were not only theirs. The room they had left behind continued to hum with other people's commentary, and the town would soon stitch the narrative into something thinner and more durable than truth. The next morning, Sofia went out to the market to breathe air that couldn't be bought. The town had its own rhythm of early shoppers and stall keepers who traded in gossip as freely as bread.
She walked with the kind of small anonymity that comforts people who know how to be overlooked. A child called her name from a cart. She smiled and waved without thinking. The world felt ordinary in a way that was both relief and an accusation. She had thought, perhaps naively, that the humiliation would stay confined to the hall. But Bet had extended the performance. At a small, bright boutique that sold jewelry for milestone moments, one of Bet's friends had arranged for a show of cruelty. Sofia entered to buy a simple bracelet as a gift for Daisy, who had helped dress her the night before. The boutique smelled of polish and lemon. Sunlight caught on a display case and turned dust into glitter. "Do you need help?" asked the shop's assistant, a young woman with a practiced patience. Sofia moved toward the counter where a delicate chain lay beneath glass. She gestured, and the young woman lifted the lid with clinical precision. Sofia placed her hand over the chain and allowed herself a moment to imagine something lovely without cost. From the doorway, harsh laughter cut through the miniature calm. Bet and Fred had arrived with two friends in tow, gliding in like royalty inspecting a province. Fred's gaze landed on Sofia with the dangerous clarity of someone who likes to name things and then dismiss them. He raised an eyebrow and then made sure everyone heard. "Everything's lovely," he said loudly. "Even for someone with shoes like those." The assistant's fingers tightened on the chain.
Sofia felt the eyes on her, eager for the shame they had been promised. Bet moved forward and whispered something to the shop owner. The owner looked at Sofia as if a line had been crossed, an assumption that wealth measured character. Then it happened. The shop's small alarm for petty theft deterrence started at the cashier. The assistant froze. Someone accused someone else. Voices tumbled into accusation like crumpled paper. Sofia felt the color drain from her face as if the room had baptized her poor with public ceremony. A bracelet that had been in a display case minutes before appeared on the floor. Bet feigned shock as if none of this were rehearsed. "You see," Bet said, loud and theatrical. "How convenient." Sofia knelt instinctively, heart hammering as she reached to pick up the bracelet. Her fingers brushed the cool metal, and the ledger of shame threatened to add a new page. People gathered close. They waited for the moment she would be unmasked. "Are you accusing me?" she asked, and the question was not the brittle sound of an outraged person, but the clear tone of someone who intended to be understood. "Because you should be accusing the right person." A hand, calm and certain, slid into the circle. Cedric's presence arrived like a wedge between truth and performance. He crouched beside Sofia, as if proximity alone might steady the world. He looked at the bracelet, then at the assistant, then at Bet. "Why would she steal anything?" he asked simply. "She's a guest in town, isn't she? Are we going to judge her for the way others have arranged her life?" That sentence, quiet, obvious, and unshowy, changed the room's temperature again. Fred's face tightened as if he had been struck. Bet's lip curled. The shop owner had the power to call the police, but consultation with a wealthy customer held more weight. Conveniences of social order rearranged themselves with an almost audible shuffle. In the end, the bracelet was found in a bag belonging to a member of Bet's circle, an assistant who had been angling for the favor of a richer patron. It was a small thing to uncover, but in that market sunlit room it felt like a vindication. The shopkeeper apologized to Sofia, then bowed their head in mannered submission to the wealthy patrons. The crowd dispersed. Sofia felt both relief and a prickle of guilt. The vindication had been necessary and incomplete. "You see," Daisy whispered in her ear later when they sat on a bench watching the town go by, "you stood up for yourself." Sofia folded the bracelet into her palm like a small trophy that had cost nothing and everything. "I didn't stand up," she said. "I just refused to be the spectacle they wanted." The incident rippled. Word spread in small, verdant eddies. The girl had been accused but proven innocent. It wasn't perfect vindication. Social memory is long and selective. But it was a start. Evidence that not every scene could be manufactured.
It was also the day she began to see Cedric differently. His protection had been quiet and instinctive, not the flashy declaration the tabloids would make of it if they could. There was a delicacy in how he navigated the tiny court of town judgments. He did not domineer. He orchestrated. On more than one occasion, people who commanded a room bowed their heads as he passed. Assistants hovered near him with a look of sanctioned fear. Once, the florist approached him in the marketplace and lowered her voice as if speaking to a patron of much higher consequence than his outward trappings suggested. That evening, he asked if she would walk with him to the outskirts, to a small vineyard that belonged to the town's wealthier family but was being remodeled into a boutique hotel. The project needed hands and a manager in place as the renovation proceeded. "I think you'd be perfect to oversee the opening," he offered. "You have an eye for detail. You know how to make people feel welcome." Sofia blinked. It was more than a job. It was an opportunity for legitimacy in a town where reputation could be a shield. But it was also a position arranged by them, by the same group who had just considered her an interloper. Why would they entrust her with anything unless something else was at play? "Why me?" she asked. "Why would they trust me with something this important?" Cedric smiled then, not for the world but for her. "Because you are not someone who tolerates spectacle," he said. "You make the best of what you are given." There was a beat of silence, and for the first time she let herself notice his hand, those small gestures she had missed, the way he kept a glass, the careful way he signed his name. A watch glinted for a flash, and something in the way he spoke over the vineyard's rough boards suggested he knew more about the town's legal and financial weavings than he'd ever let on. She accepted the role more from an instinct to be useful than from any lofty plan. It promised dignity, work, responsibility, a place to stand so that her days might not be measured by other people's judgments. She imagined sweat on her palms, lists of suppliers, the small and satisfying tyranny of details. The job required competence, and she had a kind of competence that money could not buy. When they walked back toward the town under a sky that had gone the color of old coins, a car slowed beside them. From the passenger seat, a pale woman waved, eyes ringed with a tiredness that suggested illness more than malice. "Cedric," she called, "is this the site? I was told to come by." He answered, deferential in a way that made Sofia's skin ripple with curiosity. "Yes, we could use your input." The woman climbed out. Her hair was neat but sparse at the edges. Her hands had the tremulous energy of someone who had learned to measure herself against the day's required medicines. She smiled weakly and offered a name, Rachel. Rachel.
The name settled in Sofia's mouth like an unfamiliar coin. Rachel's expression flicked between gratitude and something else, something sharp. There was an angle to the way she studied Sofia, an assessment as quick as the tilt of a spoon. She shook Sofia's hand, and her fingers lingered too long, a touch that carried warning. "I'm recovering," Rachel said, in a voice that skimmed between apology and claim. "I thought I might come by and see what you're doing for the town." Sofia felt Cedric's gaze on Rachel, then away, a glance that was soft with memory and hard with reserve. He introduced Rachel around, and the woman accepted with a practiced politeness. But when she and Cedric spoke privately, the conversation's tone dropped into something quieter, more complex. Sofia tried to listen from a respectful distance, curious about the dynamics she had been folded into by fate. When Rachel finally left, she walked without haste, and for a moment she looked back as if measuring the territory she left behind and the place she might reclaim. Cedric watched but did not follow. "She seems fragile," observed Daisy when they were alone again, the obvious softness in her voice belying the sharpness of her mind. "Are you sure she isn't trouble?" Sofia shrugged. "People get sick. Sometimes they get better. Sometimes they come back with knives hidden inside their smiles." They laughed, but the laughter was thin. The vineyard scent lingered, earth, crushed leaves, the promise of fermentation. Sofia pocketed a wine label Cedric handed her as they paused near a stack of crates. It read in simple lettering, "Collins & Sons, Est 1923. The name hung like a note on a ledger in her head. Collins, Dom, power with a familiar, polite face. That night, after the town's lights winked out and the house's quiet settled in, Sofia found a slip of paper tucked into her coat pocket. It wasn't there when she left. The handwriting was neither childish nor anonymous. It was deliberate. "Don't trust appearances," it read. "Not everyone is what they seem." She sat on the edge of her bed and turned the paper over in the dark. The room smelled faintly of lemon and old books, a comfort she'd learned to carry. Her thoughts braided. Cedric's watch, the way people bend around him, Dom's private divan, Rachel's lingering gaze. Her father's confession replayed in her mind, a signature to bind them. The note could have been left by anyone, a friend, a warning, a prank. But its arrival felt like an omen. She smoothed the paper and slid it into a drawer. The knot in her stomach did not loosen, but it acquired shape. That night she lay awake with plans stirring. How to run a hotel, how to take inventory, how to set a budget. She also planned how to keep her dignity intact under the weight of public opinion. Before sleep claimed her, she whispered the facts like a charm. "He humiliated me for being poor. He didn't know my father forced him to marry me."
The lines were not accusations for the night air, but a ledger she balanced with an odd private patience. Outside, in the silent corridor of the house, footsteps clicked, deliberate and faint. Cedric paused at the door, as if deciding whether to knock. He chose not to. Instead, he pressed his palm to the wood and walked away. The watch on his wrist shone once in the moonlight. The next morning, the town hummed with its small rituals. Sofia arrived at the vineyard project with lists and a schedule. The workers were rough-handed and honest. The architect had a dry humor that made Sofia laugh. She felt useful and increasingly visible in a way that didn't feel like exposure so much as placement. The job was a grid of responsibilities and rewards. She came to relish the quiet victories, an order placed correctly, a room planned for light, a staff trained to greet rather than judge. Word of her competence filtered back to the hallways where the wealthy men kept their gossip. A few sent messages of surprise. One of Dom's lieutenants, a manager named Devon, stopped by the site and watched Sofia for a long time. There was an intensity to his assessment that made her hold her posture like a flag. "Good work," Devon said finally, and his voice carried a weight that wasn't praise so much as acknowledgement. "You see more than most." Sofia thanked him, then asked hesitantly, "Why would someone like you notice me?" Devon's lips twitched. "Because I notice people who do things right," he said, "and because the Collins family, Dom, like to know who handles their affairs." The mention of Dom's name had a gravity. Sofia felt the circle tightening, not like a trap, but like a net that could also catch support. She filed the conversation away with other small facts: Devon's respect, Cedric's watch, Rachel's uncertain smile. Late in the afternoon, a courier arrived with a sealed envelope bearing the Collins crest. It was an invitation to a private dinner at the Collins estate, an event half official in tone. They wanted to meet the project's manager. Sofia's stomach did a small flip of apprehension and something almost like ambition. She could decline and maintain the gentle anonymity of the market, or she could accept and step further into a world that measured her worth by standards she had never been taught. She tucked the letter into her apron and walked to the kitchen where Daisy chopped parsley. "What do you think?" she asked. Daisy looked up, knife poised. "You go, and you don't apologize for anything. You speak like you know the balance sheets, because you do." Sofia laughed, a short, incredulous noise. "I have no balance sheets." Daisy rolled her eyes. "You'll learn. Watch and learn. The moment someone starts interrogating you, ask about the ledger. Men who own things are excellent at lying about what they carry in their pockets." Sofia left for the estate as the sky dimmed and the first stars arrived.
The Collins home rose like a tasteful fortress on the hill, stone, glass, and the kind of manicured gardens that breathe money. At the gate, uniformed staff bowed with practiced deference. One of them, a young man named Tomas, who had once carried crates at the market and now had a uniform, opened the door with a speed that suggested instructions issued earlier. His nod toward Cedric was small and precise. Inside, the dining room smelled of rosemary and slow-cooked lamb. Dom sat at the head of the table like a figure from another century, an immovable ledger. He watched Sofia with eyes that assessed like a creditor weighing collateral. Around him were men with expensive collars and smooth hair, people who watched for signs of weakness like dogs trained to mark scent. When Sofia approached, she could feel the room's temperature adjust. She remembered again the slip of paper in her drawer and the words that said, "Don't trust appearances." She folded that warning into the back of her mind like a card to be played later. "Miss Alvarez," Dom said, the name crisp. "You are doing well with the project. We appreciate someone who keeps things in order." "Thank you, sir," Sofia replied, voice clear. "I believe in good work. It should be available to everyone." Dom considered her as if evaluating a fine meal. "Good work," he agreed, then leaned forward. "You come from a family who required assistance. It takes a certain character to accept help without staining the family name." The edge in his voice caused a sting. Sofia's father had already paid one price. Dom's assessment suggested she might owe another, but she set her jaw against the impulse to shrink. "I believe names can be mended," she said, "with time and effort." He studied her face and then turned to Cedric. "And you, Cedric, you've chosen an ally who keeps you grounded." Cedric's response was minimal, an economy of words that implied so much more. "She keeps people honest, Mr. Collins." Something shifted in the room at that. A slight drawing in among the men, a recognition that Cedric's opinions deserved attention.
The watch at his wrist flashed again as he moved his hand to the glass. Dom's gaze lingered on that motion with a tilt of interest that felt like an account being opened. At dinner's end, Dom rose and spoke with a voice that filled the room without trying. "We must be careful who we allow to influence our businesses," he said. "But there is merit in competence. Miss Alvarez, you have the Collins attention. Use it wisely." Sofia left the table with a new kind of burden. Not only had she been put on display, but someone with significant leverage had noticed her. The note in her drawer had said, "Don't trust appearances." She now had to decide which appearances could be trusted, and which masked a blade. On the drive home, under the town's quiet stars, Cedric finally spoke in a voice that belonged only to her. "There's more than you see."
"I know it seems like everything is arranged to humiliate you, but there is a logic in that house." "What kind of logic?" she asked. "Power knows its lines," he said. "It understands where influence sits. Sometimes it pretends to be indifferent to hide its reach." Sofia's mouth twitched. "So your watch is more than a timepiece, then?" He smiled without embarrassment. "You noticed it." She felt then an entrance into a deeper part of their arrangement. He had not yet revealed his place in the ledger, but she understood now that he was not the hapless man the town had painted. That realization did not erase the humiliation of the night before, but it added a new variable to the equation. Perhaps the person who had been forced into this union had more irons in the fire than anyone suspected. They returned to the house in companionable silence. The room held the faint smell of lemon and a sound like a page turning in the dark. Sofia sat on the edge of her bed and reopened the drawer where the warning note lay. She smoothed it out and placed it on the bedside table. Around it she stacked the wine label with the hotel's eventual logo and the bracelet from the boutique. Objects made of small certainties. She fell asleep thinking of the evening, of Dom's measured words, of Cedric's hints, of the note that had arrived unbidden. The world had shifted slightly on its axis. Where there had been only shame and a manufactured humiliation, there were now threads of opportunity and layers of deception. She promised herself she would pull at each thread, not to unravel herself further, but to find the pattern beneath. In the quiet moments of the night, as the moon rode low and the town slept, the phone on her bedside table buzzed. The screen flashed an unknown number. She considered ignoring it. She had been making a habit of avoiding surprises. But her thumb slid and the call connected. "Miss Alvarez?" a voice asked, low and edged like careful paper. "This is Devon. I thought you should know. Someone's been asking about your father in town." Sofia sat up. "Who?" "A man from the creditors. He left a note. He's been mentioned near the docks. I can't say more over the phone. Be careful." The line went quiet for a long breath. Then Devon added, as if remembering to be a human being rather than an emissary of power, "You're doing well with the project. Keep your head down and your ledger clean." Sofia swallowed, thinking of debts and arrangements and the soft paper that can bind people like invoices. "Thank you," she said. "And Devon?" "Yes. Tell Cedric not to be too quick to forgive," she said, meaning it for someone she had no right to instruct. People who bend around others are not always what they seem. There was a small crackle on the line. "I will," Devon said. "And Miss Alvarez, watch the watch." The click of the phone ending sounded like a final punctuation to the night. Sofia stared at the silent drawer where the note lay. She smoothed it again and whispered the 3 sentences she'd been wearing as armor. "He humiliated me for being poor. He didn't know my father forced him to marry me. And then somehow, someone somewhere, powerful and patient, would have to kneel." She did not know who would kneel, or whether kneeling would mean apology or submission. It seemed, in the deep logic of the world she had been cast into, that power could be made to bow if the lever were long enough and well placed. She pictured angles and ropes and the careful dismantling of a structure built on contempt. Tomorrow would require courage of a different kind. She would go to the vineyard, sign papers, face Dom's men, and keep a ledger of small, honest things. She would continue to be visible, but on her terms. Somewhere in the estate, upstairs in a small office whose door wore a brass plate, a man in a crisp suit set down a glass, smoothed the hand over the watch on his wrist, and reached for the phone. He dialed a number that opened closed rooms. "Yes, Dom," he said when a voice answered on the other end. "I'm here. Everything is proceeding." The voice on the other end was low and clipped. "Good," Dom replied. "Keep watch over Miss Alvarez. She may be poor, but she is dangerous if she learns to be useful." The man, Cedric, hesitated, the watch catching the light again as he turned his wrist under the lamp. "I will," he said finally.
His tone had a commitment that was not submission. It held the weight of a person balancing obligation against loyalty. On the bedside table, Sofia turned off the lamp and lay back down. The town hummed with small machines of gossip and finance, and she had placed herself at the center of a machine she had not chosen but could learn to direct. She closed her eyes on plans and promises and the whisper of a future she could not yet name. The next day, when she arrived at the site, the first workman to greet her carried a parcel from the Collins estate. It contained a leather-bound notebook and a pen, an unexpected gift. There was a simple note inside from Dom: "Keep records, keep faith." Sofia held the notebook like a talisman and opened to the first page. In the corner, someone had written in a careful hand, "Watch the watch." The words felt like a jolt of cold water. She snapped the notebook shut and felt in the palm of her hand the small object, the silver pendant, warm from her skin. She slid the pendant over her head and fastened it. It felt like a small private armor against the city's eager eyes. She had been humiliated. She had also begun to be seen. Between those two facts lay a thin road she intended to walk without tripping over the consequences laid down by others. A car pulled up at the edge of the vineyard. Tobias, the foreman, waved. He had news: workers arriving early, supplies delayed, and a man asking to speak with Sofia alone. As she approached, a figure stepped from the car and paused on the gravel.
The figure was neither man nor woman. It wore the air of someone whose life had been shuttled between meetings and power. It was a face she did not expect to see. Rachel, whose smile had seemed fragile at the estate and whose presence had been a slight pinprick of unease, stood in the light, hair tucked under a scarf. She held herself with the tired weight of someone who had held a lamp too long over a failing thing. "You wanted to speak?" Sofia asked, not sure she did. Rachel placed a hand over the pendant at her own throat, a reflex that commanded attention. "I did," she said slowly. "I thought perhaps there were things we could discuss." Sofia watched the woman's expression, careful, small, and then, like a shadow thickening, a vein of something else, hunger and history braided with claim. "About Cedric," Rachel added, the three words folding the air between them. "About what he really is." Sofia's heart thudded, and everything inside her, the note, the watch, Devon's phone call, Sofia's heart thudded, and everything inside her, the note, the watch, Devon's phone call, pulled tight like a wire. Rachel watched him with a slow, almost clinical smile, and then, as if deciding how to deliver a blow, she stepped closer. "You think you know him, Miss Alvarez," Rachel said softly. "You think the man who takes your hand is some ordinary soul. But there are rooms you haven't been invited into. There are decisions he makes when the lights go low. I once loved him. I once thought I could be his life. Then I learned what it cost to stand beside him." Sofia watched Cedric's jaw move under his skin. He did not answer Rachel. He simply let her speak, as if measuring whether each word might be true. "What are you saying?" Sofia asked. The vineyard creaked around them. Pallets of crates made a hollow chorus. "Are you trying to get me to leave him?" Rachel laughed, a dry sound. "No, I'm telling you what you deserve to know. You're going to be caught between them, what you were forced into and what he really is." Sofia felt the room tilt. The note in her pocket seemed hotter now. The words, "Don't trust appearances," pressed like a coin. She had already begun to learn how to read Cedric in small gestures, but Rachel's admission suggested a map she had not seen. "Tell me plainly," she asked. "Do you want him back, or do you want to hurt him?" "Both," Rachel said simply. "And I want them all to know who they hurt when they humiliate people for being poor." Before Sofia could answer, her phone buzzed against her hip. A message from Daisy. "Are you okay? There's chaos at the Collins. Dom is sick. Doctor's upstairs. Call when you can." The words "sick" landed like thunder. Sofia's chest clenched. "What happened?" she demanded, though she already felt the answer. Poison would explain the abrupt collapse at a formal dinner. A poisoned cup could be the instrument of revenge Rachel hinted at. Rachel's eyes narrowed, and for a moment the fragile mask slipped.
"People forget consequences," she said. "They make bargains with vultures. Sometimes the vultures come home." Sofia left the vineyard with the labels still in her pocket and the smell of crushed grapes in her hair. The town had already begun to buzz. One of the Collins cars sped past and turned towards the estate. She saw Cedric hesitate, and then he moved with a sudden authoritative purpose that erased the man she had supposed powerless. He caught up to her at the gate, breathless. "Dom," she asked, too quickly. "At the hospital," he said. His voice had a brittle edge. "He was at a private dinner. He took ill. Tests are being done. There's talk of toxins." Sofia's hands found his sleeve, as if the touch could root her. Who would do this?
Someone who wanted him gone, Cedric said. Someone who knew the house and the household. They used a slow-acting agent. It's not over yet. They rode together to the Collins estate, where reporters gathered like flies at a wound. Lights from news vans painted the stone an unnatural blue. Dom lay propped in a bed in a private wing of the hospital, pale and steady under machines that beamed soft light. Doctors moved in efficient choreography. Devon waited near the door with a face that had gone hard in the last hours. "How is he?" Sofia asked, and the question felt small in the face of the machines. "Stable," Devon said, "but they found traces, enough to suspect poisoning. We sealed the dinner room. Security's looking through staff lists, guests. This won't be a quiet thing." Devon's eyes flicked to Cedric and then to Sofia. "Miss, you should be careful. Rachel's been seen near the estate tonight. She has a history with the household. We're compiling witness statements." Sofia felt the note in her drawer tightened into an accusation. "Rachel was at the vineyard," she said. "She came to talk to me." Devon's expression did not change, but he gave Cedric a look of recognition, a silent report. "We suspected she might show up," he said. "She has been making small demands, money, favors. There were threats if her needs weren't met. I didn't think she would go this far." "Who would protect her if she was desperate?" Sofia asked aloud. "Who would let her believe that violence could fix an old wrong?" Devon's answer was the kind people give when they are part protector and part prisoner to the system. "Some people in this town owe money, Miss Alvarez. Desperation wears many faces." The hospital became an investigative stage. Officers came and went with clipboards. A list of guests at the dinner was read aloud in whispers. Among the names, Rachel's presence could be traced to a late invitation, then to a private call between her and a staff member. Something else surfaced as well, a trace of a purchased compound, delivered anonymously in small quantities, enough to poison a single dish. Sofia wanted to do something more than watch. She was not content to be the passenger in other people's dramas.
She went to the nurses on a quiet wing, asked if there was anything she could do to help, and by paying attention found a small error in the inventory of cutlery from the dinner, one set missing and a spoon misplaced. The nurse looked at her in surprise and then nodded. "Thank you," she said. "Palms are busy. It fits into the timeline." It was a small contribution to a large machine, but it gave Sofia the sense of a seam she could pull at. She started to put pieces together, not like a detective, but like someone who had learned to read the ledger of people's choices. Meanwhile, Dom's illness loosened secrets. Interviews turned into confessions as staff admitted to strange deliveries and a temporary cleaning job that had been taken by a new woman, a woman with nervous hands and a list of unpaid bills. From the hospital's security footage, investigators recovered a blurred figure moving through the service entrance the night of the dinner. A hair left on a napkin would later be matched to Rachel. It was the kind of detail that made narratives coherent. A motive, a hand, a face. When Rachel's name came up, the town had an opinion already. Old gossip pieces were unearthed, debts were traced, and a financial connection to a creditor came to light. Rachel had been borrowing small sums from men who expected returns. She had lost a job, and for reasons that were ugly and deep, she wanted Dom to pay for slights that had once been done to her, real or imagined. But Rachel's motives were not only about money. She had loved Cedric, and in losing him she believed she had been cast out of a life she had expected. In her fractured logic, removing Dom meant toppling the world that had denied her. Her revenge was both calculated and personal. The investigation moved in waves. Officers interviewed Rachel, who was evasive and small at first. Then she grew larger, and her lies began to lose their shape. She spoke of being wronged, of people who had treated her like a remainder. She spoke of being invisible until she became useful for the curiosity of others. A week into the inquiries, Dom's recovery halted. He had an allergic reaction to a medication, then an infection that had been suppressed by something. Every day was a ledger of new threats, and the police followed each line. Then the call came that erased the careful, methodical rhythm of the investigation and replaced it with a raw panic. Daisy's voice on Sofia's phone was a jagged thing. "Sophia, it's Daisy. She's gone. They took her." "What do you mean?" Sophia's mouth was dry. 1,000 small alarms made noise in her mind. "Rachel," Daisy said. "She said if the family didn't apologize, she would make them pay. She came to the hotel. Somehow she got in, and she took me. She took me to an old house by the river, but it's not just me, it's you. She knows you're pregnant." Sofia stopped breathing for a count that felt like forever. The necklace at her collarbone burned under her skin. Pregnancy.
The word, which had been private and queerly bright inside her, suddenly flipped into a target. Whoever held that information could leverage it. "Tell me where they are," Sofia said. She felt strangely calm because fear had a way of clearing the fog. "Tell me everything." Daisy gave her a rough description. A house with broken shutters, a white van with no plates, a man who watched the road. She said Rachel's voice had been clear.
She wanted what had been taken, and she wanted to unmake the weddings and deals that had bound people. Sofia's first instinct was to go. She felt at once the desire to be a martyr and the need to be practical. She thought of the wine label she had left tucked into her pocket that morning and how small things could become signals. She told Daisy to try and leave breadcrumbs, notes, anything, while she called Devon and Cedric. Cedric's response came immediate and brittle. "Don't go anywhere alone," he said. "We're bringing security. We have people who can track the van by the route the phone last pinged." Sofia wanted to be angry at his careful tone. It felt like an attempt to cordon off her agency, so she pushed against his hand when he reached for the sleeve of her coat. "I'm not a thing to be moved," she said. "If they have Daisy, they're not only going to hurt me, they're going to hurt her. We need to move fast." Cedric's face tightened with an emotion too complex for a single name. He looked at her as if calculating something that his watch could not measure. "I'll get the managers," he said. "I'll get the police, but I need you to trust me, truly trust me." Sofia could only stare at him for a heartbeat, weighing the honesty in his eyes. "I trust you until you give me a reason not to," she said, "but I'm not stepping back for a seat in someone's pocket." They moved like a unit that had been built in crisis. Devon coordinated with the police. Tomas, the uniformed gatekeeper who had been promoted by proximity and trust, remembered the route a white van had taken months ago near a loading dock. A gas attendant recalled a conversation about a house by the river where strange men sometimes slept. A face matched a blurred security frame. The threads became rope. At the river, the old house crouched like a moth-eaten secret. The police parked a distance away and left Cedric, Devon, and a few trained men to approach with the steadier caution of people who had to hold lives in their hands. Daisy's call had gone silent for a dangerous moment. Then a whisper crackled. "We're in a room with no windows. There's a box. She can't see. She can hear ticking. Rachel's voice right outside says the world must pay." The men moved in. Sofia was kept back with trembling hands and a promise that they would try to get Daisy out. Someone told her to wait in a car. She refused. She would not be left on the curb. They entered with helmets, with police lights bouncing off the river's black water.
Inside, the house smelled of dust and sadness. A door stood closed at the back. They heard a muffled voice, a name called like a light. They knocked. Rachel opened the door and scanned the hallway as if waiting for a production to begin. Her hands were steady. She was small and precise and dangerous. "Miss Alvarez," Rachel said with a theatrical bow. "You came." Sofia saw Daisy propped against a chair, her hands bound but her eyes wide and defiant. A small metal box sat on a table between them. A wire led to something concealed beneath fabric. The ticking was real, a thin, relentless drum. "Step back," the lead officer said into a tight microphone. "We need to secure this. Rachel, this is over. Put the device down." Rachel's face changed. The soft edges snapped into a harder shape. "Over?" she whispered. "Is it over? Look at him. Look at what they do. They trade us like goods. They dress in linen while our children sleep hungry." "You're not getting what you want with a box," Cedric said, stepping into the doorway, his voice low and the presence of someone used to making people obey. "This is not the path." Rachel's eyes flicked to Cedric like a blade searching for a heart. "You were supposed to come to me," she said. "You promised. You married her instead." "I didn't promise," Cedric began. "You promised you would be different," she cut him off. "You promised you would not leave me to beg. You promised." "You don't know what I promised," Cedric said. "You never asked for what I could give. You took a story and turned it into a debt." Rachel's hand moved faster than anyone anticipated. She pushed past the officer and grabbed Daisy as a shield. The man lashed out to catch her, and Rachel twisted, pulling something metallic from her scarf, something small, with enough of a lure to make hearts quicken. The wire vibrated as she pressed it into a palm, her face a portrait of someone who had made a sacrament of destruction. "Everyone away from the door," the police shouted. Sofia felt hands at her shoulders pulling, but she planted her feet and refused to be dragged. She watched as Rachel raised her voice to the room like a summons. "What will you do?" Rachel cried. "Will the Collins kneel when their world is torn? Will they cry to heaven? Or will they look at the woman they humiliated and call it mercy?" Sofia moved. She could not just watch someone hold Daisy like meat. She stepped forward with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "Rachel," she said, soft and full of a patience that burned. "This isn't justice. This is a mistake." Rachel's eyes locked on her, and for one small breath, the world narrowed to two women before a ticking machine. "You were just another piece," Rachel said. "You were a hand that held a cup in the right moment. You were the one they used to make the ledger clean."
Sofia swallowed, and then, because she had never been trained in how to disarm literal bombs, She did what she had always done with metaphorical ones. She spoke the truth she knew. "I wasn't given a choice," she said. "My father made a decision and it brought us here. I'm sorry for what you suffered. I'm sorry you were hurt. But killing people will not return what you lost. It will take what you tried to hold." The wire hummed. Rachel laughed, a shaking sound. "What is your value to me? A life? A child? You still wear the necklace." Sofia touched the pendant at her throat, as if naming the small talisman might anchor her. She remembered how she'd refused to be a spectacle, and the way she had learned to thread small acts into meaning. She looked at Daisy, at the policeman, at Cedric, his hands by his sides, not moving to be macho, but preparing to act in a way that would make survival possible. "We can negotiate," Cedric said, and his voice became the thing that moved other people to breathe. "We can give you what you need: money, a safe place, help. But not this." Rachel's eyes moved like machinery calculating loss and gain. She had expected the patriarch to beg. She had expected the famous names to kneel and tremble for the scandal she would serve up. Instead, she had a woman in the center who had grown up poor, but whose presence was a kind of defiance, someone not broken. She had a man who had not given the performance of a lover abandoned, but who instead radiated the authority of a man with resources. For a moment, the world hung in a breath. It could have broken into fire. Instead, Cedric did something subtle and seismic. He moved closer, on a line that felt like surrender, and then he dropped to one knee, not as a supplicant before Rachel, but before everyone present. It was a gesture that startled because it contradicted the choreography of power the house expected. He bent his head slightly, not as a lover bending to a rival, but as a man making a public act of contrition and of commitment. "I kneel before you," he said, voice clear. "Not in apology to the one who forced this marriage, but in apology for every way we have allowed people to feel small in this house. I kneel because dignity was taken from you, Miss Alvarez, by my silence. I kneel because I will not let that theft continue." Silence hit the room like a wave. Rachel's face flickered with confusion and fury. The police looked at each other. Daisy began to cry, softly. The man on the floor with a wire in his hand shifted, uncertain how to respond to a public kneel that changed the game's code. It was not a plea for mercy from the criminal. It was a reclamation of humanity for the woman he had married under circumstances neither had chosen. "You will not bargain with violence," he continued. "Put the device down. Let us talk. Let me promise you, no one in that house will treat another person as less. I will make sure of it." Rachel's hand wavered.
The gunmetal box ticked on. For a breath, the world was fragile as glass. Then, with a small sound like a breaking twig, she let her arm fall, and the box clattered to the floor. An officer stepped forward and fumbled with the controls that would ensure it could not detonate. They took Rachel away. They unbound Daisy. The devices were secured and examined without melodrama. A bomb squad arrived with quiet competence. In the end, the news would call Rachel's plan dramatic but doomed. The town would call it a spectacle. But in the small room where it had happened, Sofia felt an exhaustion like a tide receding. That night, she sat with Daisy and Cedric in the back of the house while police filed reports. She touched the place her child would be, where the life she carried, still raw with its secret, felt like both vulnerability and armor. "You saved us," Daisy whispered into her hair. "I thought I was going to die. I thought—" Sofia wrapped her arms around Daisy and let the tears come. "You saved me by being brave," she said.
Don't ever think otherwise." Cedric watched them with a strange mixture of relief and a new gravity. Later, when the house was quiet and the exactness of a plan could be traced into smaller steps, he took Sofia aside in the Collins parlor. The room smelled faintly of rosemary from the dinner that had been interrupted, and Dom's presence felt like a card left on the table. "You could have walked away," Sofia said. "You could have let them do what they'd planned." "I couldn't," Cedric said simply. "You didn't deserve that. Daisy didn't deserve that. And Dom, if he had been killed, what would that have meant? A family could have been destroyed on an old grudge." Sofia's voice came out raw. "You didn't know my father forced you into this. I told you that. Do you still feel trapped? Did you ever understand?" Cedric's face softened with a shadow of something like shame. "I didn't know," he admitted. "I thought at first that it was a mutual arrangement between families, maybe something that made sense in its logic. I would have stopped it if I'd known you'd been pulled into it as a bargain." Sofia considered the watch on his wrist, the same watch that had caught her attention at the wedding, and she thought of Devon's words, "Watch the watch." She thought of the letter Dom had sent, "Keep records, keep faith." Suddenly, all those small objects were not mere props, but a pattern of care and restraint. "So why did you hesitate?" she asked. "Why didn't you stand more publicly for me from the beginning?" Cedric's hands found hers, and he did not kneel this time. He simply looked at her with an honesty that had been carved on the edges by what they'd survived. "Because I was taught restraint," he said. "Because I had a role where being loud would have damaged what I could do from inside. Because there are ways to wield power that make more work than noise. But that doesn't excuse anything."
"I should have said your name louder when they threw stones." Sofia felt the confession and the ache of it. There was a line of accountability formed that she did not want to blur. "You didn't humiliate me," she said. "Other people did. They chose cruelty. And yet," he said, "you wore that shame like armor. You stood through it. For that, He stopped, searching for the right phrase, the one that made a clean break with the ledger she'd been forced into. Without thinking fully through the performance, he did what had stunned Rachel in the house. He knelt down in front of her in the quiet parlor, away from cameras and men with agendas, and took her hand in his. "Sofia," he said, voice close and precise and without any show, "I kneel to ask for forgiveness for my silence. I kneel because I want to promise you, publicly, privately, that I will never let you be humiliated by my silence again. I will stand up to those who think themselves superior because of money. And I kneel not to own you, but to ask you, will you allow me to be at your side as a partner in the only sense that matters, your choice?" Her breath caught at the simplicity and the radical humility of the act. In the old world of ledgers and exchanges, kneeling had been the performative submission of someone who had owed everything. In that moment, his kneel was the opposite, a declaration that he would shoulder the shame the world had tried to put on her so that she did not have to wear it alone. Sofia's world was full of reasons to distrust gestures. She had been arranged, traded, judged, paraded, but she had also watched him act with courage, quiet, decisive, not for show. The gesture moved her in a way she did not expect. "I don't know what love looks like in a house like this," she said, fighting the way her voice trembled. "I don't know if I want to be someone's answer to a debt." "I'm not asking to be your answer to a debt," Cedric said. "I'm asking to be the person who stands with you on your terms. I will be the man who defends you. I will not be the man who decides for you." She let the silence sit, and then she laughed, a small, incredulous sound like a cracked bell. "That's a lot of promises." "It's the best I have," he said simply. Sofia's decision did not come all at once. It came in small nods, in the memory of his hand at her shoulder at the wedding, in the way he had not striven for applause when the bomb was being disarmed, in the way his presence could make people comply without spectacle. It also came from a deeper place, the knowledge that she had a child inside her and wanted to be protected by someone who would choose dignity over power plays. When she finally reached down and offered him her hand, she did not pull him up. She left him kneeling, a small sacrament between them.
They had not resolved everything. Rachel would face charges, the police would sift through evidence, newspapers would write sharp lines about humiliation and privilege.
Bet and Fred would feel the ripple of social consequences in ways that would hurt their pride. Dom would recover slowly and examine his household like a man who understood how brittle life had become. The investigations that followed were methodical. Rachel's link to debt collectors and to dubious men who had benefited from anonymity was exposed. A criminal case was assembled. In court, she argued she had been wronged and sought a kind of revenge she thought the law would not give her. The judge, however, focused on the terror she had inflicted. The community watched the trial like a mirror turned to itself. Dom, recuperating, made small gestures that felt like an attempt at atonement. He called Sofia to a meeting in the old drawing room where the family kept portraits like accusations framed in glass. He used the word apology in a way men from his generation sometimes can't. Clumsy, precise, full of debt. "Sofia," he said, pulling the shirt of his power aside like a small confession. "I gave orders like a man who thought numbers could solve human waste. I thought the household could be balanced by paper. I didn't see the cost." Sofia watched the man who had sat like a son at the table, the one who had used the word Dom like an admonition. She felt a complex relief at his attempt to take ownership, and a tempered anger for the lifetime of consequences his arrogance had made. She accepted his apology in the only way she could, by demanding change. "You will do more than apologize," she said. "You will open positions. You will make sure people like Daisy can have wages that don't force them to risk their bodies. You will untie the systems that make people pawns." Dom listened, and after a long pause, nodded. "We will begin with the ledger, Miss Alvarez," he said with the old gravity. "We will put money where words have been. We'll institute protections. I will not be able to undo everything, but we will begin." It was unsatisfying and important at once. Sofia felt the world shift as if a heavier object had been added to the scale. Outside in the town, the social life that had felt so quick to shame began to reposition itself. Neighbors who had been amused by a spectacle found themselves uncomfortable with the knowledge that the spectacle had almost killed a man and might have killed others. Bet and Fred's laughter dried in the face of public scorn. Their invitations were fewer. The boutique owner who once bowed to their favor now stood up to them. Small people found courage in the example. The Vineyard Project became a different kind of site, not a place of patronage, but a place of employment. Under Sofia's management, the hotel took on a new air. Rooms were arranged to be inviting rather than ostentatious, and staff were treated as people, not ornaments. People who had once thought less of her now found themselves learning from her competence. Months passed, and the town stitched itself into a new pattern.
Rachel was tried and convicted. Conviction tempered by the court's consideration of her history and the manipulation she had endured. She was sentenced, not to annihilation, but to a period where she would be out of the way long enough for the wounds to stop bleeding. It was justice with a complicated edge. At a public meeting that Dom arranged, the Collins family called together a sort of reckoning. People from places that had once been shunned were given seats. There were speeches that tasted of restraint and of genuine feeling. Devin stood with the managers and spoke of the need to train employees well and to pay fair wages. Tomas was promoted. Daisy received an official letter that made her employment stable. The gestures were small but concrete. Then, at the close of that meeting, when cameras and the town had gathered to see whether the old hierarchy would flex its muscle or be humbled, Cedric stepped forward and did something that would be replayed for months. He removed his jacket, walked to the small stage where Sofia sat, and knelt, this time in front of everyone. It was not an exaggerated show, but a deliberate move. The cameras caught the flash of his watch as he bent. The hall inhaled. Bet's face turned a color that matched the marble. The patriarch looked as if he'd swallowed a stone. People who had delighted in the old hierarchies felt the air shift. Cedric's voice was steady and low, so that even those in the back could hear. "I have been raised to lead," he said. "In that role, I have learned to hold quiet. I have learned to keep accounts and make decisions that look clean. But clean accounts do not always clean the soul. I kneel before Miss Sofia Alvarez because she was placed in a bargain she did not sign. I kneel because I failed to speak loud enough when she was humiliated. I kneel because dignity matters more than a ledger." The act broke the room like sunlight through a high window. People wept and others looked away. His kneel was not a performance for the cameras, but a public admission that power had a moral cost and that it could be spent in service, not in domination. Dom, who until then had been the symbol of a closed system, surprised them all. Instead of taking the moment as a reprimand of Cedric or a rebuke to Sofia, he rose and placed a hand on his colleague's shoulder. "Get up," Dom said, voice soft. "Not because I ask it, but because dignity is not returned by kneeling alone. It is returned by action.
"We'll make these changes, Cedric. We'll make them now." Cedric rose, and where he stood, there was a shift. The man who had seemed mere husband, mere quiet, now carried an authority that had the weight of consequence. He was not a showpiece of the household. He had been the hand in the machinery all along. The watch had been more than a stylish piece. It was a symbol of a life that measured more than minutes. He was the person who could make things change from the inside.
Sofia looked at him, then at the man who had knelt for her in private and in public, and saw not only a protector, but an ally. She imagined a life where she would not have to live at the mercy of other people's laughter. She thought of the child she would raise, a child who would know that dignity could be defended. They did not rush into marriage vows again, as if trying to sanctify a contract undone. Instead, they rebuilt trust. Cedric used his positions. He had influence over the company's initiatives and control over hiring and fair pay to put in place measures that would protect workers. He supported programs that made it harder for desperation to be turned into danger. He also became, in the town's ledgered way, a man of consequence, one whose decisions now had a different aim. Sofia, for her part, refused to be the wife whose worth would be measured by a ring alone. She ran the hotel with a clear mind and a firm hand. She hired people who had been previously ignored. She opened a small day program that taught accounting and management to young women who had no family money, a place where you could learn to balance ledgers and not feel shamed for the first number in your pocket. When the baby came months later, it felt like a small, luminous verdict. The hospital room was warm. Daisy held one hand, Cedric the other. Dom called from his recovery bed, and even Bet had sent a card that didn't contain poison. The child was a new ledger line that no amount of old gossip could erase. On a bright afternoon, not unlike the day she had walked into the boutique, Sofia stood in front of the Collins estate with the child in her arms. There were people gathered, friends and those whose faces had once been maps of disdain. Bet approached with the awkwardness of someone who had been stripped of certainty. She stopped short of apology and instead offered a small, honest statement. "I was wrong," Bet said, voice flat with a new humility. "I treated you like an ornament. I forgot that people have souls." Sofia accepted the words with a gravity that felt like the last payment in a long, unfair debt. She did not offer a reservoir of easy forgiveness. She accepted that people could change enough to be bearable. At the center of the lawn, Cedric took her hand and bowed, not in submission this time, but in partnership. Then, in the circle of those who had once judged, he knelt again, not as a spectacle, but as a promise that had been kept. The cameras framed it, the town watched, and the line of humiliation that had once been so sharp smoothed into something else, a public reversal that made dignity visible. "He humiliated me for being poor," Sofia had said the first night, a private sentence that had become a drumbeat. In the months after, the town had learned that humiliation was a choice, and that the people who made it had to answer for it. "He didn't know my father forced him to marry me," she had thought then.
Cedric had learned it too. They had unspooled the truth together and chosen how to respond. And then the CEO kneels. The line that had sounded like a promise of dramatic spectacle turned into a real human thing. An executive kneeling not to demand a favor, but to show he would bear responsibility. The movie of their lives would later write it in summaries and headlines, but the truth of it, the quiet rearrangement, sat in small moments. The hotel where children could be fed, the wages that let people sleep through the night, the mother's hand that smoothed a cheek. The world did not change with a single gesture, but the gestures had weight, and they had consequence. On the veranda where the family had once judged, Cedric stood, now announced as the new chief of one of the house's enterprises, a position he had taken to steer policy rather than to swell power. He did not take it to be a man above others, but to be someone who would not let others feel small in his watch. The watch still glinted on his wrist, but now it read like a tool rather than an ornament. Sofia walked beside him, not hidden and not paraded. She had her own name in the town's ledger, a manager, an employer, a mother. The pendant at her throat was still there, warmed by the day's sun. She had come to learn that dignity was something to be defended, fought for, and sometimes publicly sworn to protect. When the man who had once laughed at her for being poor met her eyes that afternoon, he could not find the cruelty in himself anymore. The town would not let him practice it.
The society that had once excused such behavior had learned a lesson. People cannot be made small without cost. Sofia's final look at the house where she had been humiliated now read like a ledger corrected. She held her child to her chest and looked at Cedric, the man who had not known the bargain his father had struck and had, of his own volition, chosen to kneel. The action had shifted the balance, and in the hush that followed, the world felt like it might become something else, less cruel, slightly more kind. They would all carry the scars. Some relationships had ended, some would heal slowly, but in that moment the child in Sofia's arms was a small defiant proof that life moved forward, and that humiliation, when met by dignity and by people who chose to stand, could be transformed into accountability, mercy, and yes, a new kind of strength.